my name is Shirgi, and in this video I'll be talking about how to write those big, grand, epic, cinematic, orchestral chords. Just all the buzzwords for a wonderful YouTube composing tutorial. I've seen other clips floating around the tutorials on how to write these kinds of cinematic chords, and I disagree with almost every single one of them. I want to give you examples that you can hear for yourself on why writing in those other ways is not befitting of a big epic chord, and why the way that I'm going to show you is not the be-all and end-all of orchestration, of course, but I would like to lay out some general principles for when you want to write these big, grand chords. I understand that not everyone is going to be, classically trained and listen to classical music enough for even to care about this kind of nuance when writing these cinematic scores. But out of pure spite and anger, which I know you can feel just emanating from my vitriolic heart, I will be writing my own tutorial on how to write these nice grand chords. So what I have here is a standard orchestra, nothing special. I have chords written down here. You don't need to understand what these symbols mean. I just have them because this is how I write music. The harmony is original. It is of my own invention. I didn't take this from another orchestral piece or anything. But I have taken like a general consensus average of other producing / composing orchestral tutorials for writing these cinematic chords, and I've arranged the instruments like so. I'll play this example for you first, and then I will discuss how I've orchestrated this, and then I'll talk about its strengths and its weaknesses. And I hope this chord progression sounds epic enough that it's befitting of getting a grand orchestral treatment. I think in isolation that would sound perfectly fine, and I don't know if I would call that ready to ship, but it's certainly on the right track, is what I would say if I didn't know any better. The problem here is not necessarily that it's too gaudy or too big sounding or anything like that. I love big, overly dramatic chords, just the same as all of you. However, my problem with this is that it's not dramatic enough. There is so much more you can do to make this chord even bigger. My frustration lies with that those other tutorials are not showing you the full extent and power that the orchestra has. So let's run down how I've arranged the chords so far. First, we have the violins playing the melody. Up in the high end, very screechy, very easy to hear over everyone else, which is a good thing. You want to be able to hear your melody over everyone else. We have the brass section here, tubas, trombones, trumpets, and horns. They're all playing rather far apart from each other. The tuba and the trombones are playing rather far apart, making up the bass and also part of the tenor. And the trumpets and the horns are playing the rest of the chord, filling in the rest of the harmony. Altogether, the brass section sounds like this. Also, I have a bunch of instruments just heavy hitting some of those chords. I have here timpani, bass drum, tom-toms, and two kinds of cymbals. If you don't already know, the suspended cymbal is the kind of cymbal that you put on a stand, and piatti are the kind of cymbals that you hold in your hands and you clash together. Boom! And of course, it's not an epic orchestral, cinematic, grand, whatever track without a huge choir to go with it. I think what's great about this kind of orchestration is that you can very clearly hear the melody with the wonderful strings. The brass playing down here low in the bass really gives a nice gravelly and solid foundation for the rest of the orchestra. Choir here is lovely, fills a concert hall beautifully, and definitely fills your speakers. There's one thing that's really irking me about this kind of orchestration, is that if I just go over here to the left and uncheck this box right here, you'll notice that the rest of the orchestra isn't doing anything. And it's not like these are uncommon instruments of an orchestra either. These are the entire woodwind section empty. Nothing in sight. And also, believe it or not, the string section is made up of more than just violins. I don't know if you guys knew this, but if you ever look at an orchestra, you know that even if you don't know the names of these, you know there's, the small violin, there's the slightly bigger violin, and there's like the big violins. Like there's more than just the tiny violins that are in the string section. There's so much more potential to be had here with the rest of the orchestra. The first thing that I would like to change here is the writing in the violins. It's okay, quite okay to have violins playing up high here. However, I think these strings would sound even more massive if they played in octaves. So what I've done here is that I've just lowered the second violins by 1 octave. So these guys, first and second violins, are playing an octave apart. It gives the strings a much fuller sound instead of just being screechy. And let me tell you, if you want that screechy sound, the entire woodwind section is begging to play something. First, let's listen to how it sounded before. And now let's listen to what it sounds like after. Let's shift our attention over to the brass section here. I think it's perfectly fine for these tubas and trombones to play together like this. I think I'm going to go ahead and make it so that the tuba and the trombones are actually all playing the same thing, because I didn't have it set up that way. So now they're all just going to be playing the bass notes. Whereas before they were playing a bit of harmony, and so they felt just a tiny bit weaker. I really like these octaves. They feel a lot more powerful to me. I would also like to kind of state a general principle of orchestrating these kinds of whole orchestra chords. We call them tutti chords, when the entire orchestra is playing together. Brass likes to be in close harmony, by which I mean brass, they like to play close together. Over here, the brass is playing kind of far apart. So I'm going to go ahead and just get to rewriting these chords. I'll show you how I'm going to write this first chord here, which is just a simple G major chord. I'm not going to do any fancy extensions or anything like that. This is a pure G, B, D chord. First, what I'm going to do is just outline the entire chord in the horns. We have 4 horns. Horns have an incredibly large range. They can play notes in a huge range. That's 4 octaves. Generally, I would say that horns like to blare in this lower-ish range. Horns playing up here, they might give you a few looks, and to be honest, it doesn't sound as good as a trumpet or even any of these woodwinds do. Unless it's given like a nice solo, but if it's playing chords, it just sounds kind of weird and strained up here. It's much better if the horns are playing nice and low down here. I see that's a lot of ledger lines. I'm going to go ahead and make that in the bass clef. Compared to how they were playing before, these chords sound more full. Now trumpets, similarly, they like to be close together, so let's play that here. All together, before the brass sounded like this. And now the brass should sound much more full, like this. Now I'm going to get to writing the rest of these chords, and I'll be back when I'm finished. Now I finished writing the chords in the brass. The chords here are much more dense than they are over here, and I'll play for them for you side by side so you can hear the difference. I'm going to show you something very easy peasy. Composers don't want you to know about this. Just take the whatever's playing in the violins and you can put it up here in the flutes, that's fine. If you don't really know what you're doing, I think this is perfectly fine. It's okay. Flutes are very good at reinforcing violins. I would also say clarinets are great at that too. More so in more slow, soft, and lyrical passages, so I wouldn't really do it here. You could do the same with oboes too. Just keep in mind that oboes, they can't go as high as a flute. I mean, my program will play that, but It's not a very pleasant sound. Notice here that I didn't write the brass very high. In fact, almost none of these notes even touch the main 5 lines of the staff. I mean, well, they do if you turn off transposing, whatever. I know a bunch of nerds are going to call me out on that, but just shut up. The brass is more resonant, mostly in its lower range. And, well, don't you just want to hear that beautiful blaring brass in the lower range? If you raise these chords up an octave, these instruments will be able to play it, but see how nice that sounds? It's too nice. Doesn't sound evil enough. Doesn't have quite that punch. How wonderful and smooth. Maybe the climax of a beautiful, slow dance or something. That's great. But for us, no, we want it nice and down low. Now we're writing chords for the rest of the woodwinds. I would first suggest you include a kubassoon, also known as a contrabassoon. Contrabassoon is a wonderful, wonderful instrument. And usually for these kinds of things, I would just say have it play with the tubas playing. Although make it a bit louder because the contrabassoon is a woodwind instrument, so it's not as loud as a tuba. A tuba is actually exceptionally loud. You got to be a little bit careful in writing for it because it's so loud. If you don't know what a contrabassoon is and are a little skeptical of using it, just listen to it and I'm sure that will convince you. Now I will use the fact that woodwinds are generally more resonant in this upper range, whereas the brass is more resonant in this lower range, so I wrote it in the lower range. I will write these beautiful woodwind instruments in the higher range. Notice here though that the bassoon is in the bass clef because it is normally a bass instrument. So don't write it too high, you don't want to be writing treble clefs in here or anything. The bassoon is capable of playing these notes, but it's very weak here and very strained sounding. Perfect if you want a very lyrical and sadder kind of passage, but that's not what we have here, is it? So I will put the bassoons squarely in their kind of middle-ish to high-ish range. Clarinet's down here in this more middle part of the staff. The thing about the clarinet is that it's kind of a weird exception to some of these like instrument range rules that you might find, is that the clarinet is actually very resonant down here in its lower range and up here in its higher range. But here in the middle, the clarinet is actually in its weakest range. By comparison, you can just kind of hear that this note here sounds more strained than this here, where it sounds exceptionally clear, and down here where it sounds wonderfully dark. Not really up there that deep, but mostly in this kind of middle part here is where it has the weakest notes. So for this reason, I would suggest putting your clarinets nice and up high. Let's listen to these woodwinds together. See what kind of brilliant and shining tone the woodwinds can bring to your orchestra. I think it's such a shame that people are missing out on writing these. Notice here that there's actually like a huge gap in between these notes here, which is where these oboe guys are going to come in and they're going to fill in the gaps here. The oboes sound great in this like middle to higher range. Up here it's a bit strained all the way up here, but like up here more like is a bit better for the oboe. However, since that part's already being filled in by the clarinet, I will put the oboes in this range down here. Now together with the flutes. So like before, I'll fill in the rest of the harmony and I'll come back to you when it's finished. Now I've finished writing in the harmonies for the woodwinds, so let's hear what they sound like together. Now, there's one last kind of instrument that we need to deal with, and it's the strings because these guys aren't doing anything. Now, I've written nice close harmony here in the brass, and I've written some kind of more open but very bright high-end harmony here in the woodwinds. So what are we going to do with the stringies? The string section is made up of a lot of players, and they have a very big, dense, and almost foggy kind of sound, I would say. The strings need to chillax the most when it comes to these big chords. They need to stick to playing the bass notes and maybe the melody. Not too much harmony, I would say. The reason for this is because if you write too many instrument groups in these kinds of close harmonies, especially here in the bass, the entire sound is going to get a little bit too murky and it's not going to sound very clear and not very good. You want to be able to not only have a big grand sound, but you want to be able to hear the chord in its purest kind of tone, at least for what we're doing. That's the kind of sound I'm aiming for right now. So I'll make it so that I'll very expertly and lazily just have these guys play the bass notes in whatever range suits them most. There you go. Easy peasy. Whereas here the brass played the lower end, and the woodwinds, except for the contrabassoon and some of the bassoons, but they mostly played on the high end, so these guys don't really clash with each other too much. If we hear them all together, they're sticking to their side of the road, where the brass is in the lower and the woodwinds are in the upper. However, if we include the strings here playing somewhere in the middle or upper, high, or low, the thing is they're going to start muddying the water a little bit with their sound, and because of this you don't want to write the strings in too close harmony, which means you don't want to write the notes of the chords too close together, and an easy way to avoid this is to just make them play the bass notes in octaves. Now there are a few more things we can do here to make our chords sound just that much more massive. And the first thing we can do is to make it so that our melody is not just being played in octaves and in unison, but we can also make it so that these guys are playing in, say, thirds or sixths. So now what I've done here is that I've put the two flutes playing in thirds, at least where I could. They don't play thirds all the time. Sometimes they play fourths just to conform a bit more to the harmony here and the chords. But in general, they're playing thirds and they sound like this. You can also include this wonderful instrument called the piccolo, which is just a flute, but even flutier. For those of you that write classical music already, you already know what is about to go down. Oh man. Oh my gosh. I can't wait to hear what this note sounds like. Oh my goodness. Okay, well, that sounds kind of terrible and grating on its own, but I can almost guarantee you that it makes this part sound even more big and brilliant. Also, if you've listened to film music in the last, I don't know, 50 years, film composers have taken a huge liking towards this instrument called the bass trombone. You know how a trombone in this lower range sounds real resonant and gravelly? Well, just take that and multiply it by 2. Our score is getting quite big. It's flying off the page here because I have so much going on, but that's okay. That's how you know you're doing it right. Right now I have a more or less standard setup for an orchestra with pairs of the same woodwind, so 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons. I did add these special instruments like the piccolo and the contrabassoon, but everything else is rather standard, you know. 4 horns, sometimes there are 6 horns, you could get away with writing for 6 or even 8 horns sometimes. I would say 4 or 6 is more than enough, especially because trombones kind of fill in the gaps that other horns usually do. 2 trumpets, 2 trombones. A bass trombone is pretty standard nowadays, so you can always write a bass trombone pretty safely. And then of course the strings are very standard. But if you wanted to write even more of these instruments, 3 more trombones, 6 more clarinets, 18 more horns, then, you know, I guess you could. I would just say that when you start writing for too many instruments, there becomes a point where you start to lose the luster and quality of a chord in favor of loudness. As much as I keep saying that I love these big orchestral chords, you gotta keep in mind that you don't necessarily need a huge orchestra to come across as big and grand. You can get away with just a little bit. It's not about the size of your orchestra, it's what you do with it. And a great way to make a chord sound bigger than it really is to make something else sound quite small by comparison. So before you have these big grand chords, you can follow it up with some quiet chords. And I don't just mean like less instruments playing, I do mean like quiet chords. So now that we're finally done with our orchestrations, let's listen to both of these side by side. First the old version, and then the new version. That'll be all for my little tutorial on how to write these kind of big orchestral chords. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that you enjoyed watching me write these chords for you. Please subscribe to my channel, and you can join my Discord server. The link to the Discord server is down in the description, and I will see you guys later. Bye bye!